Catherine Stimson, whom we are fortunate to welcome to our campus this evening, is a remarkable scholar, author, mentor, and public intellectual. Her academic leadership and her innovative teaching and thinking about higher education and graduate training have made a formative contribution to the intellectual life of this country. Presently, University Professor and Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at New York University. Dean Stimson previously taught at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, where she was Dean of the Graduate School and Vice Provost, and at Barnard College, where she directed the Women's Center. She has served as the president of the Modern Language Association and as director of the Fellows Program at the MacArthur Foundation. Educated at Bryn Mawr, Cambridge University, and Columbia, Dean Stimson has stood at the helm of initiatives that have shaped the American academic landscape of the past 3 decades. In 1974, she founded Science, Journal of Women, which she edited until 1980. As you probably know, the journal played a major role in the history of women's studies. Dean Stimson is the author of over 150 books and articles. Her publications also include creative works, a novel, class notes, and creative fiction and nonfiction. The great American modernist Gertrude Stein has been a protagonist of Dean Stimson's scholarship. And it was in thinking about Gertrude Stein that Catherine Stimson formulated some of her most influential theoretical ideas. I'm thinking particularly of her essay, Mind, Body, and Gertrude Stein, originally published in Critical Inquiry in 1977. The essay made a profound impact on me when I was a first-year graduate student and then recent immigrant from the Soviet Union, where at the time women's studies was not an academic discipline. The topic of tonight's lecture, Gertrude Stein, Woman of Faith, could not have been better chosen. And I say this not only because Catherine Stimson is among the world's leading Gertrude Steinologists. I say this also because we're very happy to have on our campus, right here, by the way, next door at the McMullen Museum, this wonderful exhibit on Jewish women and their salons, where Gertrude Stein is one of the heroines. And by the way, the museum will stay open until 10 o'clock this evening. And also, this gives me an opportunity to acknowledge our partners, the new Center for Arts and Culture, which helped to bring the exhibit here to BC. And finally, this fall, Boston College launches its Jewish Studies program. And Dean Stimson's lecture is, of course, among the highlights of our inaugural series. And finally, a brief comment about the subject of tonight's lecture. Much remains to be said and written about Gertrude Stein's complex relationship with her Jewish heritage, about the impact of Stein's Jewishness on her writing, and also about Stein's elective appropriation, cultural and otherwise, of Catholic mysticism. Like other great Jewish-born artists of her generation who remained this side of apostasy, Stein read Christian texts selectively and capriciously. Students, and I actually see several of them here tonight, who studied the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas this fall, know that Stein had 3 favorite Catholic saints: Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Teresa of Avila, and Saint Ignatius of Loyola. And by the way, I'm really surprised that Stein has not been made honorary Jesuit for that alone. I'm very serious, I know. In the autobiography, Stein and Toklas tell us very little about Stein's knowledge of Judaic holy texts and traditions, except perhaps for a brief mention of Stein's pious grandfather in Baltimore. And pious is the way it appears in the book. What exactly did Stein learn from her observant grandfather, and how she concealed and revealed that Jewish knowledge remains an open and challenging question. I suspect we shall hear some of the answers tonight. Please help me welcome our illustrious speaker, Catherine Stimson.
Can my voice be heard? Maxime, thank you so much for that warm-hearted and flattering introduction. And the mere fact that it is flattering, the mere fact that it exaggerates my virtues, does not mean I didn't like it a lot. I want to thank Boston College for inviting me. It is an institution that I very much respect, and I'm always happy to be back on this campus. I want to thank Maxime for his part in the invitation, Paul Doherty for your gracious handling of my logistics, Nancy Netzer for welcoming me, and I also am honored to be a part of the Lowell Lectureship. Now, I just want to warn you, I will talk for a while, and then we'll have questions, and I don't mean in any way to denigrate the Jesuit heritage of this wonderful school, but I did not come prepared in my text to talk about Christian mysticism. However, I would be delighted to take any questions about it, because it's absolutely true. Gertrude Stein, she loved them in Italy, she loved them in Spain, she loved them in France, but I'm not sure that the popes would always approve of her definition of sainthood. I also want to acknowledge in the audience 3 women who came in from Michigan today. So where are our Michigan friends? 4 women from Michigan to see the exhibit. So Nancy, where are you, Nancy Netzer? Aren't you proud? You have, the exhibition is so popular. And thank you for making the trip. As Maxime said, I will be exploring a question that is insufficiently explored, which is the question of Stein's relationship to the Judaism that was her birthright, although to call her observant would be inaccurate. Now, as you see, I've put my watch in front of me. I believe that your lecturer has a serious obligation, which is not to chatter on too long. And I say that especially for those of you who are crammed on little chairs against the wall. But I also do very much want to leave time for questions. I look forward to your questions. I look forward to your disagreements. I look forward to turning a lecture into a conversation. But before that, here we go. And again, even though I'm surrounded by mics and have one here, I want to make sure my voice carries, so I've appointed someone in the audience that if my voice does not carry, she is to be the canary in the mine and tell me if even my stentorian tones are not reaching the room. Okay. In 1917, a chic United States magazine, Vanity Fair, which is a remote ancestor of the current Vanity Fair, Vanity Fair published a poem, "Have They Attacked Mary?" He giggled, a political caricature. And the author of this poem was a bit annoyed because the editor cut 35 lines from the poem. And even when the lines were later restored, the poem was only 7 printed pages long. Indifferent to literary convention, the playful author insisted on calling each of the 46 sections, a page. And so page 10 consists of only 1 line. And those of you who know Stein know this line: "Can a Jew be wild?" Now, this sentence is a declarative, not interrogative. It is a statement. Can a Jew be wild? Not a question mark. The author of this sentence is, of course, Gertrude Stein. I mean, wouldn't it be odd if we came to talk together and I opened a lecture on Gertrude Stein with a line from Ernest Hemingway? And the line opens up a haunting question. How much does it matter that she was Jewish? And the answer that I have come to is that it is, as Maxime said, a very complicated question. The fact that Stein was Jewish matters a lot, much more than one might gather from reading her major works, and much more than some students of Stein might have recognized. However, and we'll explore this together, I think that being Jewish matters less to Stein than the fact that she was an American, the fact that she was a writer exploring human nature and human mind and language, the fact that she was a genius, and the fact that she was a lesbian. By the way, you all know the famous story about Gertrude Stein and genius. In her book, The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which Gertrude Stein wrote, she has Alice B. Toklas say, "I hear bells every time I'm in the presence of genius." And then Toklas goes on to say, "I've heard bells ring 3 times. When I was in the presence of Pablo Picasso, when I was in the presence of Alfred North Whitehead, and when I was in the presence of Gertrude Stein." You know, it's nice to have a partner like that. Wouldn't we all like to have a partner like that? You wake up in the morning, she says, "Hello, genius, here's your croissant." Being an American, which meant a lot to her, being a writer, being a genius, and being a lesbian were her articles of faith. And so if we think of Stein's identity as the English alphabet, her Jewishness is the letter X. As a letter, X is used less often than A for American, or W for writer, or G for genius, or L for lesbian. But the alphabet needs X if it is to be complete. And moreover, X has 2 connotations that are significant in understanding Stein as a Jew. X means mystery, something still incompletely unknown. And the second meaning of X is an absence, something erased, X'd out. And so Stein's Jewishness is still a mystery to us, but it was also something she, from time to time, erased, X'd out. Now, Stein is, as Maxime suggested, is the most radical of modern writers. If you think Joyce is radical, read Stein. If you think Hemingway is radical, read Stein. Hemingway is Reader's Digest conservatism compared to Stein. If you think Eliot is radical, read Stein. The facts of her life are well known, but let's just review them together. She was born in 1874 in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, the youngest of 5 surviving children. And as you know, there's another famous story about her. Alice B. Toklas said, "Why do you always have to tell people you were born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania?" And she said, "Well, we all have to be born someplace." And for me, it was Allegheny, Pennsylvania. Her father was one of 5 brothers in a family of German Jews that had immigrated before the Civil War. Her mother was a Kaiser, one of a family of German Jews that had settled in Baltimore before the Stein family had arrived in the United States. Gertrude and her family went from Allegheny to Europe because her father thought that the children ought to have a European education. And then they went to Oakland, California, where they were cultured, secular, assimilated, and by temperament, very idiosyncratic. The effect of Stein's California upbringing, which included the early death of her mother, has been underestimated. And I would suggest that Stein, being born in California, made her independent, aware of vast spaces, and competent at being unconventional. She was educated at Radcliffe, arriving there in 1893, following her brother Leo to Cambridge. And so those of you who are from Cambridge, you walk the streets where Gertrude Stein walked and lived in a boarding house, where her brother Leo walked, and where her favorite professor, William James, strode the streets like the Colossus that he was. I assume you all know the famous story about Stein and William James. Oh, it's a great story. And if you're a professor, don't tell your students. She was idiosyncratic, and one day brilliant student, but one day she didn't feel like taking an exam. So she wrote him a note and said, "Dear Professor James, I do not feel like taking an exam today." And he wrote back and said, "Dear Miss Stein, I often feel that way myself," and gave her an A in the course. Leo and Gertrude and their Jewish friends were aware of the anti-Semitism at Harvard. But given their class, comparatively wealthy German Jews, they were apparently inoculated against some of its more virulent strains. After a while, Stein went to Johns Hopkins Medical School, and it's unclear if she flunked out or left before being expelled. And she encountered anti-Semitism there as well. In 1903, as you know, she found a home in Paris with her brother Leo in that famous apartment and atelier at 27 Rue de Fleuris. And in 1907, she met Alice Babette Toklas, born in 1877, another Jewish Californian. The two women became lovers. Eventually, Leo was expelled from the house, but he was sort of disagreeable anyway, and they became profoundly intimate partners. Encouraged by Toklas, nurtured by Toklas, who also typed her work, Stein wrote steadily, producing over 600 plays, operas, poems, essays, autobiographies, and philosophical meditations, much unpublished until after her death. The Yale edition of her of writings published after her death runs to 8 volumes. She died of cancer in Paris in 1846, and supposedly, 1946, my God, I'm making her a Victorian, she'd kill me for this. And as you know, she said to Toklas as she was wheeled into the operation from which she never recovered, "What is the answer? What is the answer?" And Toklas said, "I was silent." And Gertrude then said to her, "In that case, what is the question?" So according to the myth, her last words were, "What is the question?" Now, because of her literary radicalism, Stein is still controversial. She is subject still to derision, ridicule, and dismissal. In 1913, an American newspaper mocked, "I called the canvas cow with cud," and hung. Then an arbiter of our culture found her, quote, "a huge, squat mountain on a distant border of the literary kingdom." And then, in 1996, but 9 years ago, the great writer Cynthia Ozick declared that Stein was but a copycat cubist, and her line, "Rose is a rose is a rose," is almost all that is left of Gertrude Stein. I love Cynthia Ozick and her work, but even great women make mistakes. But despite all this, she is more and more respected, more and more studied, more and more enjoyed, and more emulated. Anne Bogart, the stage director, once told me in conversation, "My father is Brecht," as in Bertolt Brecht. "My mother is Stein." Now, significantly, if you read through Stein's finished texts, you find comparatively little, and I underline comparatively little, that is explicitly Jewish, and that you find in bits and pieces. As the critic Barbara Will points out, critics have interpreted this negatively. Is Stein either ignoring, repressing, or repudiating her Judaism? And it's true. Stein writes frequently about her family and friends, many of whom were Jewish, but their religion and ethnicity is rarely explicitly mentioned, except in her notebooks. Stein is far more interested in their psychological makeup, in their social groupings and ungroupings, and in their linguistic patterns. Her massive early novel, The Making of Americans, being a history of a family's progress, interweaves two narratives. The first narrative is that of the Künstlerroman, that is the story of the artist growing up. And here, this writer feels herself to be singular. If you read Making of Americans, and I invite you to do it, but it's 925 pages long, so give yourself plenty of time. In the story of the writer growing up, she feels herself to be singular, dirty, strange, and alone, until someone says to her, yes, affirming her identity in her work. And after that, for Stein, singularity was positive, leading her to the singularity of the genius. And I would suggest that being a genius is yet another defense for her against the slings and arrows of anti-Semitism. So if she heard anti-Semitic comments, she became convinced she was a genius, she was exceptional, she was armored against these insults. But there's a second narrative in The Making of Americans, and that's a saga of two families, the Dennings and the Herzlans, loosely based on Stein's own families. And they are immigrants from Europe who come to America and become Americans. And it's interesting, because one grandfather is religious. His religion gives him an important feeling, observable to all who live with him. And this religious man has a sense of the everlasting as he is dying. There's an oldest daughter who has a dull, stubborn religion that gives her power over her children. But notably, in this huge book about immigrant families based on Stein's own German Jewish families, her characters might as well be Seventh-day Adventists, by which I mean they are religious, but the exact religion is not really mentioned. I think Stein does this because her great literary project in this novel is to find the deep laws of human nature that underline such elements of identity as race, religion, or gender. We read Making of Americans, or some people do, as a Jewish novel, but that's only because we know that Stein was Jewish. If you were to read Making of Americans without knowing that Stein was Jewish, it would look like a far more general narrative about people coming and becoming Americans. But I said there's comparatively little that is explicitly Jewish, but there is some. Her very first novel, significantly, QED, was written in 1903, and it was suppressed until after her death. She supposedly lost it. I mean, there's so many fabulous stories about Stein. You really have to shut me up, otherwise I'll never get to the end of my lecture. Supposedly, she lost it. Lost it, yes. And then Alice B. Toklas found it in the 1930s and got very, very angry, and the two of them didn't speak for many, many months. And then finally, after Stein died, Toklas published it under a different title. It's a very autobiographical novel. It concerns three women in an unresolvable erotic triangle. They are introduced as college-bred American women of the wealthier class, but there are differences among them to which Stein gives national and racial significance. There is Helen Thomas, who is the American version of the English handsome girl. And then there's a character named Mabel Neath, who looks like she is from New England, but deep down inside is tropical and decadent. Or as Stein writes of her, the decadent days of Italian greatness. She looks like she comes from Chestnut Hill, but she looks like a wicked Medici woman. And the Stein figure, the figure based on Stein, is called Adele. She's overweight, as Stein was. Overweight is sometimes a polite way to put it. She's ample. She is Jewish. She likes the sun. She likes her comforts. She loves language. And this character says, I never seem to know how to keep still, but you both know already that I have the failing of my tribe. I believe in the sacred rights of conversation, even when it is a monologue. Something I occasionally apply to myself. And she has some other satirical references to being Jewish as character. She says, I always did thank God I wasn't born a woman. A wisecrack that does just a little bit of gender bending. But Adele is the moral center of the book. She is the defender of middle-class values. She is the defender of middle-class customs. She's a bit naive, but this explicitly Jewish character is the moral center of the novel. And then, in ways that I really don't have time to go into because I want to leave time for questions, Stein rewrites QED later in perhaps one of her most famous books called Melanctha. And the character of Adele is rewritten as a black doctor. And what they share is the quality of being an outsider, and what they share is the quality of being very unhappy in love. In brief, if Stein writes comparatively little explicitly about being Jewish, this is not the same thing as nothing. And the rich, revelatory, and fascinating exhibit about Jewish women in their salons, and I see that many of you have the catalog, places Stein in a cultural tradition that prizes the arts, sociability, politics, and conversation. And the keepers of the salons, in this exhibit about a Jewish women who kept salons, show some family likenesses. And one family likeness that the catalog essay points out is that these women who kept salons were often, like Stein, the children of domineering fathers and passive mothers. And they were often educated, not in schools to which they often couldn't go, but by tutors. And indeed, this exhibition shows, and the catalog essay shows convincingly, that Stein belongs to this tradition of cultivated Jewish women who made their homes a center of culture and conversation. Of course, Stein kept two salons. One was with her brother Leo, and that was really devoted to avant-garde art and was a little bit raucous and wild. And then there was the salon she kept with Toklas after Leo left. And this was much more devoted to literature, though artists were still there. And quite frankly, it was a far more decorous place, controlled quite tightly by Alice B. Toklas, who decided who would see, usually men, would sit with Gertrude, while the wives would sit with Alice B. Toklas. As for Stein's explicit writing about Jews and Judaism, perhaps three great patterns exist. The first consists of her work, much of it unpublished until after her death, about her life with Toklas. Those transcriptions and evocations and literary transformations of intimacy. And here Stein is openly erotic and accepting of Toklas and her Jewishness. Have they attacked? I began with have they attacked Mary, period. He giggled, period. Parentheses, a political caricature, end parentheses. Have they attacked Mary is one such text about Stein and Toklas together. It is a dialogue between two women. But look at the word Mary. It is a pun on the Virgin Mary, the great iconic figure of the Catholicism that surrounded Stein and Toklas. And there are many jokes about the Virgin Mary in the poem. But it's also about Mary, the legal state. And it begins in this way. And imagine these two women who felt themselves to be married, but who could never marry. Quote, "Can you be more confusing by laughing? Do say yes. We are extra. We have the reasonableness of a woman, and say we do not like a room." And the lines go on. We wish we were married. It should have been quoted in a famous Massachusetts court decision. And if these two women are not legally married, they are emotionally married. A couplehood that is a combination of constancy and subversion. The second pattern, oh, by the way, there's a pun on that word wild. Can a Jew be wild? Which again cannot be said, can a Jew be wild? But can a Jew be wild? And that, look, there's a Stein puns all the time. And here are the multiple meanings of wild. One, it's a hearty statement about the Stein-Toklas passion. Two, it's an offhand and generalizing remark about Jews. And three, it's a reference to Stein as an avant-garde and wild writer, like the Fauves, those wild beasts of early 20th century art. How are you doing over in the floor? Can you hear? Is it okay? Okay. That's the first pattern, Stein and Toklas, in which the Jewishness is very obvious. The second pattern is literary allusions to Jewish thought or culture. There's a wild, crazy book called The Reflowering of the Goddess by a friend of mine named Gloria Feeman-Orenstein. And she knows that I think the book is a little gaga because she is doing what she calls feminist matristic readings, and she's looking for evidence of the great mother everywhere in culture, including Jewish culture. And she believes that Stein takes Jewish culture and then peels it off to find evidence of a great mother underneath. And she places Stein, I think a little extravagantly, in other elements of a Jewish tradition. But she does lovely readings of some of Stein's poems, including a poem called Yet Dish, which she thinks is a pun on Yiddish, but which she proves, which she demonstrates. It's really a poem about a Passover Seder. And she also looks at a poem called, now famous poem called A Sonatina Followed by Another. And in this famous poem, it's very subversive because the speaker refers to Alice as a Jew and then feeds her pork, and even refers to Alice B. Toklas as my little pig. And there's the third pattern, which is Stein's explorations of Jewish identity, which are inseparable from her lifelong interest in the nature of a group identity, be it a race or a nation. And here's the difficulty about Stein. Her explorations of Jewish identity oscillate between an affirmation of Jewish exceptionality, for example, the Jews are smarter than anybody else, and anti-Semitism. For example, in 1903, in the early part of the 20th century, she was very, very taken with a truly disagreeable book by Otto Weininger called Sex and Character. Weininger is what we would call a self-hating Jew. committed suicide in Vienna at the age of 23. Anti-Semitic book, misogynistic book. And the question is, why did Stein like it? Why were so many Jewish intellectuals attracted to it? In part, it was very tolerant of homosexuality, but it also talked about the exceptional woman who could be like a man and could approach genius. And there are those who think Stein identified with the idea that she could be a genius and perhaps read out the anti-Semitism. Stein is not perfect. She indulges in overgeneralizations and stereotyping, a habit of speaking that is profoundly at odds with her interest in the particular, the individual, and the play of differences, but whose stupidities are not limited to Jews and Judaism. Politically and sociologically, she can at times be truly inept and awful, a conversationalist and commentator who lacks self-corrections. She says, unabashedly, blacks are this, Jews are that, Chinamen are this, the Spanish are that. Chinese and blacks represent the racial other, Jews do not. But she does generalize. She gets very excited when she thinks about fathers, who are inevitably patriarchs, and Jewish fathers, whom she must resist. But her comments about Jewish fathers are probably less internalized anti-Semitism than the struggle of a daughter whose own father was ambitious, but irascible and dominating. He was the kind of father that would stop in the street and have a temper tantrum, much to the embarrassment of his children. She also wrote a good deal about Jews and money. And here you can see the stereotypes at work. Jews, she writes proudly, are always certain that money is money. And so she makes an identification with Jews and money, but on the other hand, she despises the anti-Semitic myth that Jews are money grubbers and dominant international bankers and conspiratorial moneybags. And in the 1930s and 1940s, she finally became frightened about Jew raiding. And during World War II, she attacks the myths of Jewish financial controls. But even then, when she has these passages attacking the myth of Jews as controlling the world financially, she still has this passage. She said, the Europeans keep the myth going because it serves their political purposes. But then she said, and this is just, I warn you, she says really dumb things. She says, the Jews do not want anybody to know, that is, that they're not that rich. Although they know it perfectly well, that is, that they're not that rich. They must know it, because it would make themselves feel less important. And as they're always, as the chosen people, have felt themselves to be important, they do not want anybody to know it. That is, that they are not these great conspiratorial bankers. It's unpleasant reading, but we must be honest about the figures we otherwise revere. But in the same book, the passage about money follows a section of extreme anxiety, for she has two memories. Now remember, she's writing this in World War II. She remembers the Oscar Wilde story and his imprisonment for gross indecencies, and she remembers the Dreyfus trial. And she thinks that the anti-Semitism is the Dreyfus trial is medieval in 19th century. And if Stein was going to insult you, she would call you medieval. She hated the Germans and called the Germans medieval. Or she would call you 19th century. But she says, even though the Dreyfus trial anti-Semitism is medieval in 19th century, we haven't been able to kill it. But you see her sense of vulnerability at being both Jewish and lesbian in World War II. I want now, having laid out, I think, some general overview, let us end by focusing on a part of Stein and Toklas's life that is perhaps one of the most difficult parts of her being Jewish. And it is during this period where the anti-Semitism was absolutely purged out of her. These were, of course, the years 1939 and 1946. And one of the most tangled strands in Stein's biography and writing is how did two aging American Jewish lesbians survive in France in World War II. It is a puzzle that we're only now beginning to see its outlines clearly. Well, they were, from 1939 to 1945, World War II, obviously the pressures of history were coming down on these two women. They had spent World War II in Europe, and then they decided to stay, World War I in Europe, and then they decided to stay in Europe during World War II. At first in their country home in the village of Bolignon, and then in a nearby house in the town of Culloth. And if you go to Culloth and you look at the house in which they lived, it's a nice house, it's a big house, it's at the foot of a mountain, and you wonder how the Germans ever thought they could conquer this territory and this rugged, rugged mountain. But the France of World War II was, of course, obviously terribly dangerous for them. Now, I'm so near the end of my time, and I do want to have lots of time for questions, but could I have a couple of minutes just to do a little French history here? Is that permissible, just a little? Okay. And I'm obviously, what I'm about to say, I'm going to draw very heavily on the histories of other people, such as Robert Paxton. As you know, the Germans defeated the French in May and June of 1940, and this shocked the French. How could this happen? And the armistice that followed had wide popular support, in part because of a pervasive fear of civil disorder. And then, as you know, France was divided into two parts. Remember Caesar? All Gaul is divided into three parts. Under Hitler, it was divided into two. There was an occupied zone, center was Paris, and a free or southern or unoccupied zone, its capital at Vichy. And on July 2nd, 1940, Marshal Pétain went to Vichy and began to be the titular ruler of the unoccupied zone. Stein supported the Vichy regime, at least initially. And to understand this, you have to understand that she was very conservative politically. She said of Allegheny, Pennsylvania, "I was born a Republican, and I stayed a Republican all my life," although I don't know what she would make of the current party. I know what I make of the current party, but this is not the subject of the evening. So why? But you see, here's the problem for those of you who are interested in modern culture, and I think we all are. These great avant-garde writers who broke apart the way we write and read, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, with reprehensible, at least to us, political learnings. But Stein developed, which I will tell you about in a minute. Why did she support Vichy? We now look back on Vichy and say, how could people do that? First, she feared civil disorder and unrest. She liked excitement, but only intellectually and sexually. Politically, she liked peace. Secondly, she believed that France needed national renewal and rejuvenation, that the French society she loved was in decay, and that this decay was reversible. Her lesbian may seem incompatible with Vichy, but she thought, the French are the French, I am American, and I believe we need renewal. Third, she hated communists and Bolsheviks. She hated communism. And she thought that Vichy would help put down the communists and the Bolsheviks. And finally, she admired Marshal Pétain. She found him a benevolent father figure and found him a wise father figure. And if you read Stein's writings from about 1940 to 1942, you will see this endorsement of Vichy. And indeed, in 1942, she even began the enterprise of translating Marshal Pétain's essays and speeches for an American audience, a project that never came to fruition. And there are those who say she did this because she loved him, admired him. And there are those who say she did this because by 1942, she needed an insurance policy. The armistice between France and Germany did not hold. The Germans assumed more and more virulent control. And by 1942 and after, the Germans were assuming more and more control of Vichy. But the question then becomes, how did these two aging American lesbians survive in what was really German-dominated territory? And there's two answers. One, they were protected. They were protected by a man named Bernard Fee, who was director of the National Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale. Dreadful man, Gestapo spy, but a great friend of Stein and Toklas and a translator of Stein. And he clearly had sent out orders of protection for them. And secondly, they were protected by their neighbors. The community protected them. And this particular community, you have to remember, was in the heart of Maquis country. It was in the heart of the resistance to the Germans. So the region believed they were neighbors at risk, not risky aliens. They warned Stein and Toklas when they were in danger. In 1942, Stein tells us in Wars I Have Seen, she and Toklas were told if they did not flee to Switzerland, only a few miles away, they would be sent to a concentration camp. But once again, they bet on their own inertia and their instincts in their community, and once again, they won. And then, in 1944, Eric Severai, the journalist, found Stein and arranged for her, a celebrity American who had survived the European war, to broadcast from Voiron, a town 40 miles away. And as she was discussing her survival, she told Severai that she had walked for food, that they had nearly run out of money, until a French friend had bought a Cézanne, one of the paintings Stein and Toklas had taken with them from Paris, and that the worst time had been when the Germans began rounding up the boys of 20. And yet she said she had been happy and very close to the ordinary French people. And she said that not everything about Vichy had been bad. The mayor of Culoz had been decent. He and the town had protected her and refused to turn her in when the Germans began to go after enemy aliens. Stein, the mayor told her, Gertrude, and this would be in French, of course, you are too old for a concentration camp. So why should I tell the Germans about you? But during this period, her attitude about politics changed, and she became one of the great defenders of America and American democracy. America had always been a theme of her writing, and we see her at the end of the war, rescued by the Americans, seeing this as the triumph of America. And she tells in Wars I Have Seen of hearing the voice of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the commanding general of the Allies, at the Allies landing at Normandy in 1944. And she hears the liberating armies come closer to closer. She hears American voices on the radio. And then she sees United States debris. She sees Kraft cheese wrappers and knows that the American army is near. And then, in a rush of ecstasy, when they're finally liberated, Stein and Toklas and their dog Basket run to a hotel in a nearby town and American soldiers are there. And bliss of bliss, the lieutenant and 2 privates know who Gertrude Stein is. And she is home with Americans. She later goes to Paris, and their apartment has almost survived, thanks to their neighbors in Bernard Fee. And she writes, yes, I walk around Paris. We walk around Paris all day long and night too. Everybody is walking around Paris. It is very nice. How many days are there in a week so nice? Very many, happily. Very happy. Now, Stein said of Mark Twain, and so here she survives, despite her own anti-Semitism. She survives, thanks to protection by a bad man and the friendship of good neighbors. Stein said of Mark Twain, and this is my last paragraph, that he knew a dead man was dead, and that was good. Mark Twain was a good writer because he knew when a dead man was dead. Now, I would have thought that was fairly obvious, but probably not. Shortly before Stein's death, after another burst of productivity, she arranged the disposition of her effects in her last will and testament. Her language is plain, trust into but resistant to legalisms. And do you remember I began by saying the letters of the alphabet? And what were her articles of faith, though the Judaism mattered? This is brought out in her will. For the Stein of her last will and testament is a woman who asserts elements of her identity. There were also articles of her faith. First, she is an American. The will begins, I, Gertrude Stein, a citizen of the United States, legally domiciled in Baltimore, Maryland. Next, she is a writer, worthy of being remembered. She gives the Picasso portrait of her, which she had kept throughout the war, to the Metropolitan Museum. She bequeaths her manuscripts, correspondence, and photographs to the library of Yale University and appoints her friend, Carl Van Vechten, as supervisor of the publication of her unpublished manuscripts. And finally, she is a lesbian, remembering her friend, Alice B. Toklas, and giving Toklas all the rest of her estate for the use for the rest of Toklas's life. Toklas was to die 21 years later, in 1967, and I'd like you to think of these 2 women, unconventional, brilliant, energetic, secular Jews from California, buried together in a cemetery in Catholic France. Thank you for listening to me. Yes, ma'am. I'll repeat the question for everyone after I hear it.
Yes. You did not address the inherited German component of Gertrude Stein. When I have known very many German Jewish families, especially during the war, up to the war and afterwards too, and they are so much like Gertrude Stein. They think, talk, are brilliant, self-contained, natural. I have to constantly remind myself that she is an American and actually wrote in English. And I see it again in this exhibit, that the German Jewish families are the most perfect, nicest, most brilliant human beings and collections of families. And I always think she's just like them. And I have to keep reminding myself constantly that she sees herself, that she is an American, and that she writes in English, because I always think there must be translations. No, not really. She sees herself, and she is an American. Why do I see her as so eminently German, so eminently typical
I was asked why I did, if I understood you, so correct me if I don't have the question quite correctly. My interlocutor said, why did I not stress the German Jewish part of Stein more? And that she has known many German Jewish women who seem very much like Stein. And it is hard for her, when she reads Stein, to realize that Stein is writing in English because she keeps placing Stein back in her German Jewish heritage. It's a wonderful question. And let me just make a couple of points about it. One, as I said before, and this is a point that I took from Brenda Wineapple's terrific book about Gertrude Stein and her brother Leo called Brother Sister. Wineapple suggests that the fact that they were German Jews inoculated them a bit from the anti-Semitism of Cambridge and Baltimore because they were not the more despised Russian Jews. They were thought to be a more affluent, more cultivated, cultured part of our Jewish heritage. I'm not sure Stein would agree with you. And although you see a likeness, and heaven knows, there are those who said, you know, often commented, sometimes in a very anti-Semitic way, about her features.
But I don't mean it.
Right, no, I understand. I'm not saying you are. I'm talking about how others said about her. This is the paradox of Stein. She knew that she was from a German Jewish families. In terms of Toklas, one side was German Jewish, the other side was Polish Jewish. She knew that. But I would suggest to you, now I may be wrong here, but this is my argument to you, that being an American, assimilating into America, was what mattered to her. She didn't ignore her Jewish heritage. Another point I tried to make was her ambivalence about her, sometimes anti-Semitic, sometimes praising Jewish exceptionalism. But she really did think of herself as American. That's why I ended with the first sentence of her will. I, Gertrude Stein, legally domiciled in Baltimore, Maryland. Her own attitude towards the Germans was contemptuous. Now, mind you, as I said, she always stereotypes, frequently stereotypes, but she, of all the nationalities, the one she despised the most was the Germans. She called them, she exempted the Jews here, but it was the Germans. She called them medieval, which, as I said, was a term of contempt for her. She said the Germans, they're always walking up the hill and down the hill and always in the wrong direction. And then this sense of the Germans was reinforced, of course, during the Second World War. She wrote in English. She rarely wrote in French, although during the war she would translate when she was away from being published, she would translate some of her work into French. But she loved the American language, and someone once said, well, Gertrude, why do you live in France? And she said, in effect, this is not a direct quote, but it's an accurate paraphrase, I write better in English when I am in France. Because in a sense, the English just goes on outside, but I can really hear my own English when I write in France. And there's a wonderful picture of her, I think it's in the New York Times Magazine, after the war. You know, she was very famous and she was a great favorite of the GIs, and she loved the GIs. And they would come visit her and talk to her. And one of her best books right after the war is called Brucey and Willie, about two GIs, which is one of her great analytic and passionate books about America. And they took her to Berchtesgaden, Hitler's summer home. And there's a picture of Stein standing with soldiers, reconquering Berchtesgaden. And so, yes, I suppose, although I really hate to overgeneralize, and I'm very careful of it. Yes, one can look at and say certain things about her, and you can see her family heritage, but this is not how she wanted us to see her. Yes.
Can you comment a little bit about her role as an art patron, and who was it who had the eye in between her brother and Alice and Gertrude?
Well, Nancy, you help me on this.
Oh, I'm not sure I know so much. I always assumed that it was Gertrude.
It was really both.
What is the question?
I'm sorry. The question was, in that great collection of art they built up, Gertrude and Leo, was there a leading eye? And I think probably they did it together. They adventured together. One would pick out one artist, one would pick out another. And it was Leo who brought in the Japanese prints. And there's some very interesting stuff in Brenda Wineapple's books about how Japanese prints may have influenced her style. But Gertrude brought in Picasso. And Leo did not like Picasso. So it's really a collaborative act. But what people do point out is that when Leo moved out, and there was the second salon, her tastes in artists atrophied a little. You cannot compare the rather, I'm blocking what I was about to say. You cannot compare the rather pastel Sir Francis Rose to Picasso. But it was very much a joint adventure. And remember the world they were living in. One envies them, despite the anti-Semitism. They would go discover, they went to a gallery and said, we want to see the Cézannes. And then they told, I think it was Vollard, wasn't it? Bring down Cézannes. That's not a Cézanne. We know you're having a little old lady up there in the garret trying to paint Cézannes. We want to see the real stuff. And they went exploit, and remember who they were surrounded by. They were surrounded by one of the great bohemians of modern Western culture. So they were all talking about art. They were all comparing art. They were all yelling at each other. The gays and lesbians were sleeping with each other. The straights were sleeping with each other. It was just a wild time. Stein and Toklas were known for their fidelity. You know, they upheld the standards of monogamous marriage. But there was just lots of conversation going on. Can you imagine the conversations between Stein and Picasso when she had those 156 cities, I believe it was, while he painted her portrait? Can you imagine her talking about William James and he talking about whatever? So it was, great art does not come out of a single person.
What is that reference, 156 cities?
I think it was 156 sittings that.
Oh, cities.
156 cities. Well, they were the city of conversation. And despite Stein's belief in genius, great cultural moments are like that moment in Picasso. Great cultural moments arrive when there is a confluence of different cultural forces coming together in an atmosphere that combines constraint and freedom. So you have Picasso coming up from Spain, the art master's son. And by the way, Stein names Oakland in Making of Americans after the town Gossels, where Picasso first painted some of his cubist work. They didn't have much money, although Stein and Leo had their small trust funds, and there were some patrons coming in. But the boundaries were breaking down, and there was just enormous energy. But it was many cultures together. Yes, sir?
Has the new Gertrude Stein opera been produced?
I was asked if Gertrude Stein's operas had been produced. Increasingly so. There are many, many Stein productions now. The most famous opera production, probably the most pioneering one, was of excuse me, I can't go too far from this. The most famous one was in 1934. It was the production of Four Saints in Three Acts. And I have to say this because Maxine would be very mad at me if I didn't bring it up. It was in Hartford, Connecticut. Virgil Thompson did the music. Florian Stettheimer did the sets. And it had an all-black cast. It was, and to have these Western saints, many of them of African descent, but these Western saints played by blacks and then went to Broadway was considered very radical. But there are wonderful productions of Four Saints in Three Acts. Many productions of The Mother of Us All, her last major work, which is an opera about Susan B. Anthony and feminism. And then what's also interesting is that the plays are being increasingly performed. Her very avant-garde plays now seem quite commonplace. But yes, she is now a Stein opera is still a to put on a Stein opera is not like putting on Tosca or La Boheme, but it is increasingly done. And there, of course, we have to thank Virgil Thompson's music as well. But she has many, many. I'm going to go there, and then I'm going to go there, and then I'm going to. So let's just do a diagonal line if we can.
Was she really a woman of faith, and if so, in what way?
I would say she was a woman of faith in two ways. One, she had faith in those, being an American, she had faith in her writing, she had faith in her notion of genius. It's complicated, but she distinguished between identity, which is commonplace, and what she called entity, which is a great stream of metaphysical and spiritual thought to which the genius gives us access. She had faith in that human capacity. And she had a personal faith, I think, in her life with Topers. This was not a religious faith, but it was a secular faith, and by that I mean she trusted. She trusted that all would be well. She was, now, faith in the second way, she was fascinated, as Maxine said, not just by Christian mysticism, but by mysticism. But her saints are Christian saints. And what did she mean by that? She doesn't believe in God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost. She doesn't believe in the sense that she went to church and thought there would be, and thought that this would give her access to a spiritual domain. But she thought the mystic gave us access to a spiritual domain that no religion can contain. A domain of what she would call beatitude, a transcendence of this daily life we have, where we wake up in the morning and have to have our cornflakes. And so Four Saints in Three Acts is really about beatitude. And so let's call this not faith insofar as she believed that God created the saints, but let's call it faith in the sense that there is a realm beyond our daily life. And to have access to that realm, we can call bliss. That's why I call her a woman of faith rather than religious. Because faith, at least to me, is a capacity for belief in things unseen. Religion takes that faith and places it within a context. It may be a very beautiful context. It may be a very noble context. But the task of religion is to help us structure our faith. And it's a very important task. But her faith is, again, in the second sense, what is that domain of consciousness? And she loved the saints. She loved certain buildings. She loved certain landscapes, the Spanish landscape, because she believed it gave her access to this domain. And I know there are people in this room who have that experience of access to a domain beyond our five senses. I'll be right. I'm going to go. And I'll be back to you. But here's our diagonal.
I have a related question, though. Is there a relationship, or could you comment on the relationship between Jewish mysticism and her honor for the saints? Is there any connection there?
She did not.
Of the Kabbalah.
Well, Maxine, correct me here. She did not study Jewish mysticism.
Did not.
She may have, and we don't know about it, but she much more studied Christian mysticism, and she studied literature. And she studied psychology.
At least it seems to me that this was not recorded in any systematic way by herself or her family members.
Yeah.
That's why this comment about the pious grandfather in Baltimore is so intriguing, but I think some people make too much of it, perhaps. But then again, Kate, I was hoping you would tell us.
Well, my dear Maxine, I thought I sort of had. No, but, if she lived today, she probably would do that. much with Eastern thought. She is not perfect. She is bounded and limited. But her magnitude is very something. Go.
I have 3 questions, but I'm allowed to ask one. Well, I can ask you, and you can answer whichever one you choose. The first one is...
Should I be writing this down?
No, you mentioned one thing about Passover. Did she celebrate the holidays, or is there any writing of her celebrating the holidays? No.
Her family might have, but as I was preparing this lecture, I went to the Alice B. Toklas cookbook. And believe me, it's all French recipes.
And the second one is, did she write about Zionism or Israel? Or
There is
anything?
one, she has a very interesting essay called Reverie of a Zionist. And there's a beautiful analysis of it by the critic Barbara Will in a recent issue of Modern Fiction Studies. And she also knew Zionists, and Will goes into that. But the Reverie of Zionists, as Will points out brilliantly, deconstructs any notion of identity. But I really recommend, if you're interested in this, the Barbara Will essay in Modern Fiction Studies. And it also is a nice summary of some of the current writing about Stein and Jewishness. And number 3.
My last question.
It's okay, she gets 3, they're short.
You read us a passage where she referred to Jews as they. Did she ever include herself as a we kind of entity? Was it always
It's a
they?
brilliant question. Did Stein include herself in the we of Jews, or was it always they? Frankly, for Stein, the great pronoun was I, the great we. The great we was Stein and Toklas. And the great other we was America. But she did identify with her family. Her family members, there's a woman named Phoebe Stein Davis, who was a cousin of a cousin, and interviewed family members and talked about Stein was very interested in the family. And after Toklas died, her nephew Alan Stein was together on stage. So she was very connected with her family. She had a we of family. But no, the idea of Stein as identifying with a we, especially a Zionist we, although she was interested in a lot of stuff, is hard to think. Yes, ma'am?
Apart from her being a lesbian, would you call her a feminist?
I would call her a proto-feminist, and I would say that her feminism is as idiosyncratic as much of her other thinking. She certainly was an independent woman. And the mother of us all about Susan B. Anthony is a wonderful tribute to Susan B. Anthony, although it ends with Susan B. Anthony singing My Long Life, and looking back on her life with some skepticism about it. Was it strife? Was it only strife? There's another famous story about her, that when she was leaving and/or flunked out of medical school, her women friends went to her. And Mary Garrett, who had inherited a lot of stock in the railroad, and some other women went to Johns Hopkins University, which was not only led by people whose anti-Semitism could be palpable, but also doesn't have much good to say for women. And they said to Daniel Coit Gilman, and it was as simple and as direct and as blunt as this. You want $50,000? Sure. Admit women to the medical school. Check was written, women went to the medical school. And when Stein was leaving the medical school, these women came to her and said, quote unquote, Gertrude, remember the cause of women. And she responded, you don't know what it means to be bored. So she was interested. She knew feminists. She knew she was a part of those early educated women of the late 19th century. But she was cussed. She really was cussed. She went her own way. And so did she know feminism? She very much respected Susan B. Anthony and did a lot of work on her for that opera, The Mother And she probably would have liked talking to Gloria Stein because Gloria is so smart. But it's hard to imagine her marching down the street saying votes for women. Remember, she sees herself as a writer, an American writer. And her task is to capture reality. And if her writing seemed unconventional, it's because that's how she saw the inner patterns of reality. Yes, sir?
I'm a medievalist, but I hope that won't be held against me.
She would, I won't.
Two comments. I'm wondering if her ambiguous relationship with her Judaism may in fact be influenced by the patriarchal aspects of Judaism, and that at some time, in some sense, and at some points in her life, this appealed to her, and at other times it was repugnant or difficult for her to accept. And the other question that I have is similar to the question that was asked about the Passover reference. You made one other reference that struck me, and that is a reference from the prayer book. I thank God that I have not been a created woman. It seems to me that for her to, obviously you don't have to be observant to know that passage, but I'm wondering where that came from, and I'm wondering where she got it, and I'm wondering if there aren't other tidbits of perhaps a religious life.
Oh yeah, the first question, yes, she did identify Judaism with patriarchy. And there's a passage about Jewish fathers, and then she also says this Jews always want to be fathers, she said, and yet they always resist fathers. And I think in her comment about resisting fathers, she was referring to herself. But I think that was certainly part of it, and I think that's a perception question. Remember, she had many Jewish friends, and she had this huge family in Baltimore. After mother died, her father died, she went to live with her family in Baltimore. She often lived with her family in Baltimore. She was surrounded by Jewish ethnicity, and she would have picked it up and she read a lot. But are there bits and pieces? Yes, and I think that probably what Gloria Ornstein does in finding the Passover Seder, other scholars could go through and pick this up. There's still a lot of work to be done here. But my point I was trying to make, rightly or wrongly, well or badly, the point I was trying to make is, one, as you said, the deep end of it, which then ends during the experience of the Second World War, and also that there's no single quote-unquote Jewish text. She is not Philip Roth. She is not his Erskine. She is not his Erskine. She doesn't write about urban Jewish life. But it is there. I said to a couple of friends a little while ago when I was working on this, I said, I often wonder if the Judaism isn't like just the air that she's breathing. And so it's there, and then she takes it in and doesn't pay much attention to it. But I also think she is secular, she's assimilated. She's secular. I mean, her great god is William James. Now remember, James writes about the varieties of religious experience. But Stein is interested in states of consciousness. But I think you're right. Fragments, bits and pieces, kind of pervasive atmosphere. But I go back to, forgive me for repeating myself, but I am working on Gertrude Stein. The Making of Americans, written from probably 05 to 1911. Yes, I mean, this is about her family. But you have to read the Judaism into it. She erases it. I don't think out of internalized self-hatred. I think because she wants to write deep patterns. Now, I see Paul looking at me, and I think I'm about to get the hook.
Well, we have one more question from this woman who's been sitting here all day.
You're very good. You're the last question, and before I take it, I want to thank you all for being so patient and listening to me blather on.
Do you think that it's hard to find pieces of her Jewish heritage because she is an American immigrant?
I was asked, do I think it's hard to find pieces of her Jewish heritage because she is an American immigrant. Another great question. Certainly, the pattern of immigration she reflects is the pattern of assimilation. And it is the generation that comes over, some born in Europe, some born in the United States. They come over, they go into business, they create their families, they're going to be Americans, some keep their Judaism, some are cultural Jews, some are ambivalent about it. That is the late 19th and early 20th century pattern that she reflects. But I also think why we don't see it so much in her, this in no way makes her an anti-Semite. She was interested in other things. She was not uninterested in Judaism. I mean, anti-Semite is interested in Judaism, just in a disgusting way. But she was concerned about consciousness. She was concerned about writing. Remember, I started out A-W-G-L. And the L is love as well as lesbian. And it's writing. Why am I a writer? You look at her essays. What is literature? What is America? These were the questions. And metaphysical questions. What's the difference in her terms between identity and entity? And you know, I have to say this to anyone who's watching this in the webcast, you're probably not going to hear a thing because I've been tossing this around like a pack of cards in Las Vegas. But that I think is certainly one of the reasons. But there is so much more work to be done here. And I want to thank you for your wonderful attention, and I want to thank you for your questions because you've helped me to think it through as well.